The empire is yours now, Vivian.
After 20 years of building his empire from a dusty studio apartment, my husband handed me divorce papers on our anniversary and told me I was too plain for his new life with an heiress. He thought he was trading me in for a fortune until I showed up at his wedding and a total stranger whispered the one secret that would cost him everything. He thinks he's won, but the nightmare is only just beginning for him. Welcome to the Silent Dawn Theater, where we produce revenge, karma, and romance stories daily. If you believe that justice should always find its way into the light, kindly subscribe and click the notification bell so you never miss a moment of our storytelling. My name is Vivian Edwards, and for 2 long, grueling decades, I was the invisible heartbeat of Edwards Tech. If you were to flip through the glossiest business magazines of the last 10 years, you would see his face, Grant Edwards. He's the man with the silver hair, the predatory smile, and the charismatic aura that makes investors pull out their checkbooks before he even finishes his opening sentence. The media calls him a disruptor, a genius, and a titan of industry. But if you were to step away from the flashing cameras and the glass-walled boardrooms of Manhattan, and if you were to travel back in time to the freezing winters of 2006, you would have found the real story. You would have found me. Back then, our corporate headquarters wasn't a skyscraper overlooking Central Park. It was a crumbling, single-car garage in a forgotten corner of Ohio. It was a space that smelled permanently of damp concrete, old motor oil, and the sharp metallic tang of ozone from a motherboard running far too hot for its own safety. We didn't have ergonomic leather chairs. We had 2 mismatched kitchen stools with peeling paint. We didn't have a high-speed fiber optic connection. We had a tangled mess of blue Ethernet cables that I had to manually splice together because we couldn't afford a professional technician. I remember those nights with a clarity that still stings. I can still feel the way the winter wind would whistle through the cracks in the garage door, numbing my toes until I couldn't feel them anymore. I would sit there, wrapped in a threadbare wool blanket that had belonged to my grandmother, my fingers cramped into claws as they flew across the keys of a second-hand laptop that hissed like a cornered snake every time I ran a complex simulation. I was the one who wrote the original algorithms. I was the one who stayed up until 4 a.m., my eyes bloodshot and stinging, solving the encryption bugs that would eventually revolutionize the way the entire world handles logistics. I wasn't just helping Grant. I was building the engine of his life. Grant was the salesman. I give him that. He was the one who could walk into a room and make people believe that the impossible was just a few months away. He had a way of leaning in, lowering his voice, and making a person feel like they were the only one in the world who mattered. He could charm a bird out of a tree, but I was the one who had to build the tree, plant the roots, and ensure the soil was rich enough to keep the whole thing from toppling over the moment the wind picked up. I was the strategist. I was the one who looked at the chessboard 5 moves ahead, anticipating the market crashes and the competitors' moves while Grant was busy practicing his victory speeches in the mirror. I never once complained about being the woman in the shadows. In fact, back then, I actually preferred it. I viewed our marriage as a sacred partnership, a covenant where our roles were different, but entirely equal. I was the architect. He was the polished facade. I felt a deep, quiet sense of pride when I saw him on a local news stage, knowing that the words coming out of his mouth were the ideas we had whispered to each other over lukewarm cups of ramen at 3 a.m. I thought that our shared struggle was a forge, and that the heat of those early years had tempered our bond into something as strong as the steel in our company's servers. As the years turned into decades, and our bank account grew from hundreds to millions, and eventually to billions, my role shifted in the eyes of the public. I became the elegant Mrs. Edwards. I managed our sprawling 12,000 square foot estate in Greenwich, ensuring that every piece of art, every blade of grass, and every silk curtain reflected the sterling image Grant was so obsessed with. I chaired the hospital boards, I hosted the political donors, and I ensured that every elite dinner party we held was a masterpiece of social engineering, designed to help Grant close his next big deal. I spent 20 years shielding him, protecting his fragile ego from the harsh realities of the business world, and sharpening his image until it shone like a diamond. I truly believed the love we shared was the ultimate non-disclosure agreement. I believed that because I had seen him at his absolute weakest, when he was crying in that freezing garage because our first server had crashed and we were down to our last $40, meant that we were unbreakable. I believed that the history we had built together, brick by bitter brick, was a fortress that no outsider could ever breach. What I didn't realize was that while I was building a fortress, Grant was building an exit strategy. In his new world of high-stakes mergers and billionaire branding, loyalty was just a legacy system, an outdated line of code he was ready to delete to make room for a newer, shinier update. He didn't see a partner when he looked at me anymore. He saw a relic of a past he was desperate to forget. He wanted a New York life, a power couple legacy, and in his mind, the girl from Ohio who knew how to code and didn't care for vanity was no longer a fit for the Edwards brand. I was the woman who had made him a king, and now the king wanted a queen who didn't know how much the crown actually weighed. The betrayal didn't arrive with a scream or a scandal that made the front pages. It arrived with the soft, expensive clink of fine crystal at the Gilded Oak on the night of our 20th wedding anniversary. This was a restaurant where the lighting was designed to hide the age of the patrons, and the prices were designed to keep the unsuccessful people on the other side of the velvet curtains. It was a monument to New York's elite, the kind of place where the silence was so heavy, it felt like a physical weight on your shoulders. I had spent hours preparing for this night, wearing an emerald silk dress that I had saved specifically for this milestone. It was the color Grant always told me made my eyes spark back when we had nothing but a shared dream and a studio apartment. I walked into that restaurant feeling like the luckiest woman in the world, my heart full of the kind of warmth that only 20 years of shared history can provide. But the moment I sat down across from him, the air in the booth changed. It didn't smell like the vintage Cabernet or the expensive lilies on the table. It smelled like ice. Grant sat there, silhouetted against the Manhattan skyline, his eyes fixed on the reflection of his own $50,000 watch in his wine glass rather than on me. He didn't offer a toast. He didn't reach across the table to squeeze my hand as he usually did. He looked at me with a clinical detachment that made my skin crawl, as if he were looking at a piece of equipment that had outlived its usefulness. "Vivian," he began, his voice as flat and emotionless as a dial tone. "Let's skip the sentimentality tonight. It's beneath us both, and frankly, we don't have the time." I felt a cold prickle of dread crawl up my spine. "Grant, it's our anniversary. I thought we were here to celebrate 2 decades. I even brought the original blueprints from the garage. I thought we could look at how far we've come." He didn't even acknowledge the blueprints. Instead, he reached into the breast pocket of his Italian suit and slid a thick, white manila envelope across the linen table. It landed with a heavy, final thud right next to my champagne glass, knocking over the salt shaker. "A bad omen," my grandmother would have said. "The merger with the Miller Group is the final piece of my legacy," he said, adjusting his cufflinks as if he were discussing a weather report. "It is the move that makes me a global titan, not just a successful CEO. But the Millers are a specific breed of New York old money. They value a certain aesthetic, a certain public image that resonates with the international elite. Tiffany Miller is that future. She is young, she is vibrant, and she is internationally recognized. She fits the power couple image that the world expects of a man in my position." I felt the blood drain from my face, a cold, suffocating numbness spreading from my chest to my fingertips. I couldn't breathe. The room began to spin, the sound of the nearby piano fading into a dull roar in my ears. Grant, what are you saying? We built every cent of this. Every board seat, every patent, every line of code. We did it together. You can't just aesthetic me away. And I'm grateful for the startup years. Vivian, truly, he said, standing up and towering over me, his shadow stretching across the table like a shroud. But you're the face of the struggle. You're the plain woman from Ohio who reminds the board of where I came from. Every time they see you at a gala, they think of the garage. They think of the grit and the poverty. I need them to think of the future. I need them to think of the Miller legacy. Frankly, you're bad for the brand now. You're a liability to the merger. He didn't even wait for me to speak. He didn't offer a tissue for the tears he knew were coming. I've already moved my things to the penthouse. The Greenwich house is yours, along with a settlement that should keep you comfortable in your quiet retirement. Just sign the papers and fade away gracefully. Vivian, don't make me turn this into a war. You simply cannot win. He turned on his heel and walked out of the restaurant before the appetizers even arrived, leaving me alone in a room full of billionaires who were all too polite to notice that my entire life had just been liquidated over a dinner I didn't even get to eat. The weeks that followed the anniversary dinner weren't just a period of mourning, they were a masterclass in corporate execution. I woke up the next morning in our Greenwich estate, a house that had once felt like a sanctuary of shared dreams, but now felt like a hollowed-out mausoleum. The silence was absolute. By 7 a.m, Grant's personal assistant had already cleared out his side of the walk-in closet with the efficiency of a crime scene cleaner. It was as if he were deleting a file he no longer needed. I sat on the edge of our king-sized bed, staring at the empty hangers, realizing that in Grant's mind, 20 years could be packed into 10 cardboard boxes and moved to a penthouse in Manhattan without a second thought. I retreated to my home office, the only room that still felt like it belonged to the version of me that existed before the emerald dress. I needed to work. I needed to see the data, to feel the familiar rhythm of the code to ground myself. But when I pulled my laptop toward me and tried to log into the Edwards Tech central server, my fingers froze. I typed in my password, a sequence I had used for a decade, and waited. The screen didn't open. Instead, a harsh red dialog box flashed, access denied. User not found. Contact system administrator. I felt a jolt of panic. I tried again, slower this time, my heart hammering against my ribs like a trapped bird. Access denied. I tried the backup server. Access denied. Grant hadn't just moved out of the house. He was systematically purging my digital footprint from the empire I had designed. He was locking the doors to the library I had written. Driven by a mix of desperation and a cold rising fury, I drove to the Edwards Tech headquarters. It was a glass and steel monument to our success, a building I had helped design down to the texture of the lobby marble. I thought if I could just get to my office, if I could just speak to the board members I had mentored or the department heads who had seen me work until dawn, they would see the madness of what Grant was doing. But as I approached the heavy glass doors, 2 security guards, men I had known for 5 years, men whose children's college funds I had personally contributed to, stepped out to block my path. They wouldn't even meet my eyes. "I'm sorry, Mrs. Edwards," the taller one whispered, his face flushed with a shame that should have belonged to my husband. "Mr. Edwards has issued a formal directive. Your executive clearance has been revoked. We've been instructed to courier your personal desk items to the Greenwich address by 5 o'clock today. You are no longer authorized to be on the premises. I stood there on the sidewalk of Manhattan, a woman who is technically a billionaire, yet I couldn't even get past the lobby of the company that bore my last name. I looked up at the floor-to-ceiling glass and saw Grant in the executive lounge on the 4th floor. He wasn't alone. Tiffany Miller was standing beside him, her hand draped possessively over his arm as they pointed at a digital rendering of the new Edwards Miller logo. She was 20 years younger than me, a socialite who had never written a line of code in her life, yet she was walking through my halls while I stood on the pavement like a common trespasser. Then came the social isolation, which in the high-stakes circles of the American elite is a fate worse than bankruptcy. The friends I had spent 2 decades volunteering with on hospital boards and museum committees suddenly became unreachable. My texts went unanswered. My calls went straight to voicemail. At the local country club, women who had begged for my advice months ago now turned their heads when I walked into the room, whispering behind manicured hands. Power in this world is a scent, and Grant had successfully convinced everyone that I was a liability, a fragile, reclusive wife who was stepping down for personal health reasons. He was planting stories in the tabloids, framing our divorce not as a betrayal, but as a tragic necessity because I couldn't keep up with the demands of his new global brand. I was being buried alive in a coffin made of Greenwich silk and Manhattan lies. Every time I opened my phone, I saw their faces. Grant and Tiffany at the Hamptons, Grant and Tiffany at a gala, Grant and Tiffany announcing their fairy tale engagement. I was trapped in my mansion, watching the man I had built a life with use my own resources to erase the fact that I had ever existed. He wanted the world to believe he had emerged from the garage fully formed, a self-made titan who had no need for a plain woman from Ohio. I was being written out of my own biography, and the ink was still wet. For nearly a month, I sat in the oppressive velvet silence of my office in Greenwich, surrounded by the cardboard boxes of my life that Grant had so graciously couriered back to me. He thought he had won a total victory. He believed that by cutting off my executive access, freezing our joint liquid accounts, and erasing my name from the company directory, I would simply wither away like a plant deprived of light. He assumed that without his brand to protect me, I was a non-entity, a woman who would spend the rest of her days quietly sipping tea and wondering where it all went wrong. But Grant always suffered from a very specific, very dangerous kind of male arrogance. He assumed that because he was the one standing on the stage under the spotlight, he was the only one who knew how the theater actually worked. He forgot that I was the one who had designed the stage, wired the electrics, and built the secret trapdoors that allowed him to make his grand entrances. I retreated to the only place in the world he couldn't touch, the basement of the estate. Tucked behind a false mahogany wall in the temperature-controlled wine cellar was a server room that wasn't connected to the Edwards Tech main cloud. It was my dark server, a private encrypted sandbox I had built years ago for my own high-level research and development. It was a digital fortress he didn't even know existed, and even if he did, he didn't have the technical skill to find the door. I sat down at the terminal, the cool blue light of the triple monitors reflecting in my eyes, and I began to dig. If Grant was so desperate to marry into the Miller legacy, I wanted to see the true quality of the gold he was buying. I wanted to see exactly what he was willing to trade 20 years of my loyalty for. What I found in the deep layer financial audits of the Miller Group made my blood run cold with a sudden, sharp jolt of excitement. The Miller Group wasn't a powerhouse. It was a hollowed-out husk, a gilded corpse held upright by nothing but prestige, old names, and expensive PR. For 5 years, the family had been hemorrhaging money, covering their massive losses with a dizzying series of increasingly desperate shell companies and predatory offshore loans. Tiffany Miller wasn't a billionaire heiress with a bottomless dowry. She was a desperate socialite whose family was exactly 3 months away from a total federal bankruptcy filing. They weren't merging with Grant because they wanted his vision or his innovation They were merging with him because his company's liquid cash was the only thing standing between them and the federal marshals seizing their yachts, their penthouses, and their dignity. Grant wasn't trading up to a higher social circle. He was accidentally buying a $3 billion anchor that was going to pull him straight to the bottom of the ocean before the honeymoon was even over. But the biggest shock, the one that made me let out a breathless, jagged laugh that echoed through the empty basement, came when I analyzed the land lease for the Miller Group's flagship headquarters in Manhattan. This was the crown jewel of the entire merger, the primary asset Grant was using as collateral for the massive loans required to finalize the deal. As I bypassed the final layer of encryption on the property deeds and scrolled through the historical titles, I saw a name I hadn't thought about in over a decade. The land didn't belong to the Miller family, and it didn't belong to the city of New York. It belonged to a defunct textile firm called Sterling Holdings. I felt the air leave my lungs. Sterling was my maiden name. The company was a small, forgotten trust my father had left me when he passed. A piece of worthless industrial land in a then rundown part of the city that had, over the decades, become the most expensive real estate on the planet. For 20 years, the Millers had been paying rent to a blind trust that I legally controlled. And in his narcissistic rush to be seen with Tiffany, Grant had never bothered to check the underlying title deeds. He was so busy trying to upgrade his life that he hadn't realized he was trying to sell my own land back to me just to pay for his new wife's $50,000 wedding cake. The woman he had discarded as expired and bad for the brand was, quite literally, his new family's landlord. He thought he had left me with nothing but a house in the suburbs. But in his blind arrogance, he had handed me the keys to his own execution. I wasn't just a divorcee anymore. I was the silent owner of the very ground he planned to build his future on. Can you believe the absolute nerve of Grant Edwards? After 20 years of Vivian building his dreams, he tries to delete her like she never existed. If you've ever seen a man forget who was there for him when he had nothing, type ungrateful in the comments right now. I want to see how many of you are rooting for Vivian to take it all back. And if you aren't already part of our family, hit that subscribe button and turn on the notification bell. You do not want to miss the moment Vivian finds the one secret that turns Grant's perfect wedding into a total nightmare. Trust me, the payback is coming, and it is glorious. Now, let's get back to the story. I knew that simply walking into Grant's office with a stack of papers wouldn't be enough. In the world of the ultra-wealthy, a legal threat is often just viewed as a nuisance, a cost of doing business that can be buried under a mountain of motions, delays, and high-priced attorneys. Grant would use every cent of my own money to fight me until I was too exhausted to continue. I didn't want a long, drawn-out legal battle. I wanted a surgical strike. I needed someone who worked outside the traditional lines of corporate law. Someone who understood that in the upper echelons of New York society, reputation and timing are more valuable than gold. That was when I reached out to a name whispered only in the most private boardrooms, Alaric Foster. Alaric was known as the Shadow of Wall Street. He was a man who didn't exist on social media and rarely appeared in the press, yet he held the keys to some of the most powerful trusts in the country. He was a billionaire in his own right, but he didn't care for yachts or vanity. He lived for the pure, intellectual thrill of dismantling the arrogant. We met at a secluded, private library in Midtown, a place where the books were older than the country and the mahogany walls seemed to absorb the secrets of the men who sat within them. Alaric sat across from me, his eyes sharp and analytical, looking less like a businessman and more like a general surveying a battlefield. He spent over an hour reviewing the encrypted data I had pulled from my dark server, his face a mask of cold concentration. "You realize what you have here, Vivian?" Alaric finally said, his voice a low, gravelly rumble that seemed to vibrate in the quiet room. "This isn't just a divorce settlement dispute. This is a total, scorched earth liquidation. If you play this hand correctly, Grant Edwards won't just lose his seat at the table. he'll lose the ground he's standing on. Literally and figuratively. I don't want to just win a settlement, Alaric, I said, my voice steady and cold for the first time since that night at the Gilded Oak. I want him to see the exact moment the world realizes he's a fraud. He told me I was bad for the brand. I want to show him what happens when the brand's creator takes her property back. I want the audience he craves to be the one that watches him fall. Alaric leaned back, a thin, dangerous smile playing on his lips. I like you, Vivian. Most people in your position want to beg for their life back. You want to reclaim your throne. I don't work for money. I have enough of that. I work for the pleasure of seeing a thief get caught in his own trap. Grant is a salesman who thinks he's an emperor. Let's show him the difference. For the next 5 weeks, Alaric and I became ghosts. While the world was distracted by the wedding of the century, the daily updates on Tiffany's 20, Carat Diamond, the gold, Leaf catering menus, and the guest list that read like a who's who of the American elite, we were working in the shadows. We weren't just looking at the Miller family's current debts. We were buying them. Through a series of anonymous shell companies, Alaric helped me quietly acquire the secondary debt of the Miller estate for pennies on the dollar. Every predatory loan, every leveraged asset, every unpaid vendor bill. I bought them all. We were building a financial noose, and Grant was so blinded by the glare of the flashbulbs that he was sticking his head right through the center of it. Every time I saw a headline about their fairy tale romance, I felt a deep, refreshing sense of peace. Grant was out there spending millions of dollars that he technically no longer possessed, buying a life that was already bankrupt. He was committing corporate fraud and embezzlement from our shared R&D funds, just to keep the Miller family afloat until the wedding day. He thought he was being clever, hiding the money in offshore accounts to bail out his new bride. He didn't realize that I was the one monitoring those accounts. Alaric coached me on the timing. Wait for the vows, he told me. Wait for the moment when. His ego is at its peak, when he thinks he is untouchable. That is when the fall hurts the most. I sat in my quiet house in Greenwich, watching the movers take the last of my things into storage. But I didn't feel like a victim anymore. I felt like a predator. I was no longer the discarded wife being erased from history. I was the silent owner of the future, waiting for the clock to strike 12 on a man who had forgotten that the woman he called plain was the one who had written the rules of the game. The day of the wedding of the century arrived with a crisp, biting cold that seemed to settle over Manhattan like a warning. St. Jude's Cathedral was a fortress of white lilies, expensive incense, and the collective ego of the American elite. Outside, the paparazzi were a swarm of locusts, their flashes turning the gray afternoon into a strobe light of manufactured glamour. Every major CEO, every high-ranking politician, and every socialite who mattered was packed into those pews, whispering about the merger that would supposedly consolidate the tech and luxury markets into one unstoppable Edwards, Miller monopoly. Grant stood at the altar, looking like a king who had finally conquered the world. He was dressed in a custom tuxedo that cost more than most people's homes, his chest puffed out with the unearned pride of a man who thinks he's cheated fate. Tiffany floated down the aisle like a ghost in $500,000 of white lace, a vision of new money trying to buy old respect. I walked into the cathedral just as the priest was beginning the opening rites. I didn't hide in the back, and I didn't come to beg. I walked through the heavy oak doors dressed in a sharp midnight black power suit that looked less like a garment and more like a suit of armor. The click of my heels on the ancient marble floor echoed like a gunshot through the vaulted ceiling, cutting right through the soft melody of the pipe organ. A ripple of shocked whispers moved through the pews like a wave. Grant's head snapped toward me, his face twisting into a sneer of pure, concentrated hatred. He leaned over to his best man, clearly signaling for security, to have me forcibly removed. But before the security team could even take a step, the doors behind me stayed open. 12 identical black sedans were idling at the curb, and Alaric Foster stepped into the church. He wasn't alone. He was followed by 10 men in dark suits, carrying federal court orders and gold, sealed manila envelopes. Alaric didn't look at the congregation, and he didn't look at the trembling bride. He walked with a terrifying rhythmic purpose down the center aisle, stopped in front of me, and bowed, a deep, ancient sign of respect that silenced the entire cathedral. He handed me a folder and whispered the 6 words that were picked up by Grant's high tech altar microphone, broadcasting them to every ear in the room. The empire belongs to her. Now. I walked up the altar steps, my eyes fixed on Grant's. He tried to speak, his mouth opening and closing like a fish out of water. Vivian, get out. You're ruining. This is my day. Security. There is no security coming to save you, Grant, I said, my voice steady and cold, resonating through the microphone. Because I just fired the firm that protects this building. In fact, I just fired everyone. I held up the document for the front row of billionaires to see. The Miller Group is bankrupt. They have been for years. And because you leveraged every single share of Edwards Tech and embezzled $40 million from our R&D funds to guarantee this merger, you have just defaulted on the entire company. Every patent I wrote, every building we own, and every cent in your personal accounts now belongs to the Sterling Trust. Tiffany Miller let out a jagged, high-pitched sob, her veil trembling as she realized the billionaire she was marrying was now a man with a negative net worth. But there's a bigger problem for your new brand, Grant, I continued, stepping closer until I could see the sweat beading on his forehead. You see, the Millers never owned the land this cathedral sits on, and they don't own the land their office sits on. I do. Sterling Holdings, my father's company, is the landlord, and as of 10 minutes ago, I've decided not to renew the lease. You didn't trade me in for a fortune, Grant. You traded your soul for a $3 billion debt that I just bought for pennies on the dollar. You wanted a high-profile life? Well, look around. This is the last time anyone in this room will ever look at you with anything but pity. The federal marshals moved in then. Grant was led out of the cathedral in handcuffs to face charges of corporate fraud and embezzlement, his empire crumbling before he could even finish his vows. Tiffany didn't even look back at him. She dropped her bouquet and ran for the side exit, trying to escape the cameras that were now broadcasting her family's shame to the world. I stood at that altar, surrounded by the white lilies and the smell of expensive failure, and I felt nothing but a deep, refreshing peace. The man who called me plain had just been stripped of everything by the very woman he thought he could delete. He wanted the world to watch him reach the top. Instead, they watched him fall into the abyss I had prepared for him. As I walked out of St. Jude's and into the bright, freezing Manhattan sun, I realized a truth that 20 years of marriage had hidden from me. A woman's worth is not a gift that a man bestows, and it is certainly not something a man has the power to take away. Grant thought he could delete me like a line of bad code because I was plain and bad for the brand. He was so obsessed with the image on the screen that he forgot who had built the hardware. The lesson is this: never let a man convince you that you are just a supporting character in his story. You are the author, the architect, and the owner of your own soul. People like Grant think they can trade in the person who stayed with them when they had nothing for a shinier, newer model. They forget that a house is only as strong as its foundation. If you remove the woman who built the empire doesn't just change, it collapses. I didn't just get my company back today, I got my name back. I realized that being expired in the eyes of a fool is the greatest freedom a wise woman can ever have. I am Vivian Edwards. I am the brand. And for the first time in 20 years, I'm finally writing my own ending. And that is how the woman he called expired ended up owning every single thing he ever craved. Justice was finally served. If you enjoyed seeing Vivian reclaim her power today, please subscribe to the Silent Dawn Theater. We tell stories of strength, second chances, and the secrets that change everything for women who refuse to be overlooked. Click the notification bell so you never miss our next premiere. Thank you for being part of our story today. I'll see you in the next one.